It's crazy to think Zack Snyder's Man of Steel celebrates its 10th year anniversary this year, and what's even more mind-blowing is that we never had a direct sequel to the movie. However, as I watch it again, I'm struck by how far ahead of its time this Superman film was. Man of Steel is an incredible masterpiece, with stunning visuals, massive fights, and groundbreaking reimagining of the character and his surroundings. It goes without saying that Zack Snyder is one of the most polarizing directors working today. Some individuals may loathe his films, while others love them. Based on what I've seen, he looks to be one of the directors who is unfairly maligned. You only need to look at Twitter to see the negative reactions some people have towards him simply because they dislike his movies. Some of these people have gone as far as to personally insult him and mock his family tragedy, while others have watched his movies and have been emotionally impacted by them. This guy has made a livelihood of conveying controversial topics with the most beautiful imagery imaginable. The topic of his debut film was George Romero's horror masterpiece Dawn of the Dead. As a result, he obtained offers to direct adaptations of blockbuster graphic novels 300 and Watchmen, propelling him to larger prospects, including creative authority over the two most recognized fictional characters in history, Superman and Batman. Zack Snyder's hardly anticipated Man of Steel, starring Henry Cavill as the first Superman film since Superman Returns in 2006, was released in 2013. Following the economic success of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, Warner Bros. Decided to bring Superman back to the big screen. But because Nolan didn't feel comfortable in command, he swiftly determined Zack Snyder to be the best candidate. This film was always meant to be a more grounded version of the conventional Superman story, set in a modern world of paranoia, cynicism, and never-ending news cycles. The emotional response of post-9/11 Americans to a mystery visitor from another planet who arrives on Earth with skills and talents much beyond those of normal beings is shown in Man of Steel. The President would not greet Superman with applause or a firm handshake in thanks. If some of his pals arrived in a massive alien spaceship and threatened the Earth, he would be met by tank guns, missiles, and everything else the military could throw at him. Man of Steel is a very modern take on the Boy Scouts. The movie depicts a realistic representation of what it would be like for a near god to inhabit our modern world. It is also easier to accept that, certainly, most of Clark's hometown will discover his secret identity to the realistic reflection that follows from transplanting sci-fi superheroism onto our 21st century civilization. People's complaints, I believe, were largely motivated by their unfamiliarity with the key narrative choices that contradict how these topics and concerns have been handled in the past. His parents, his father's death, his time in Smallville, and his ability to maintain a secret are all important core parts of the character. Much of Clark's biography is presented from a new perspective by deconstructing the origins and common perceptions of these events and themes in his life. When Man of Steel originally came out, many people's first thoughts were to unconsciously compare it to the first Superman films. I am certain I did. I was in the theatre observing various decisions and failing to fully appreciate them in their own context as an intentional reimagining of the Donner films, which couldn't be ignored but could also be nodded to from a new angle, asking what lies beneath the things we take for granted in these myths, imagining what the myth looks like in a more realistic and modern version of it. 2012 was a watershed moment for superhero films as we know them. Iron Man had already been around for 4 years at this point, but everything changed with the release of the Marvel's The Avengers. It's easy to argue that the release of the Marvel's first team-up film upped the bar for any possible competitors in the superhero genre, signifying a significant achievement in marketing and distribution. It was evident that whoever wanted to take on the Marvel's Titans would have to do so in a completely unique way. Perhaps this explains why Zack Snyder's Man of Steel was heralded as a breath of fresh air for the largely humorous superhero subgenre by so many comic book fans. It wasn't essential for Zack Snyder's take on Superman origin story to reinvent the wheel. It succeeded in telling an exceptionally timeless Man of Steel story that distinguished itself, the DC Extended Universe, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of narrative style. The final result was a film that recognized the relatability of superheroes and their battle for justice without being bogged down by Marvel Studios' expectations. It was about a boy who grew up wanting to protect the world, but it also showed how that protection may collide with what he believes in. However, the story does not shy away from delving into the murky waters of what Superman would imply for all of mankind. Zack Snyder's Man of Steel introduced us to the last son of Krypton in both his human and godlike incarnations. Marvel superheroes and DC superheroes of course differ in some ways. Marvel used mythological and legendary elements to create personal stories about the lives of its characters. Characters' bios are used by DC to describe mythological and legendary themes. Each approaches other utilizing one aspect to reach the other form from a different angle, and this has a huge influence on how we think about and portray these stories. The original Donner film did an excellent job of this, but Man of Steel speaks far more directly to that central aspect of the DC universe. This necessitates a new approach to the subject matter and forces the audience to reevaluate their previous views of Superman and his surroundings. The more I watched Man of Steel, the more clearly I could grasp and appreciate these components of it, and the more I began to think about my concerns in a broader and more sophisticated manner. Of course, it's entirely their decision whether these folks continue to find these things unpleasant or disappointing, but my view of Man of Steel has much improved. Any flaws are trivial in the view that it accomplishes right and its tremendous devotion to its mission. Superman, as represented by Henry Cavill, is the same person as Clark Kent. His sole secret identity is that he first does his good deeds as a traveller before donning a suit and going about his business without identifying himself to anybody who sees him. He makes no attempt to cultivate a distinctive personality for his cover identity. Instead, he just changes his dress, spectacles and hairstyle, conceals his genuine name, and hopes that no one takes a clear image or video of his face. In general, this method worked in Man of Steel. Cavill's more stylized, realistic approach adds to the outstanding, naturalistic depiction of the character's mythos, but Christopher Reeve's iconic and Oscar-winning dual portrayal of Clark's Superman identities is breathtaking and delightful. Reeves, on the other hand, basically acquired everything he needed to know from Jor-El in the Fortress of Solitude, and subsequently went on to become the successful and highly adored Superman. It's a performance rife with moral ambiguity and the continuing battle to decide how to best employ his Superman character. One of Man of Steel's most notable achievements was that it gave the DCEU a distinct tone that was unlike anything Marvel had to offer. Snyder may be to blame, but I feel the presentation as a whole deserves most of the credit. Just like some of Superman's most famous comic book moments, Zack Snyder's Man of Steel didn't hold back. Certain elements in the film's visual style are reminiscent of Christopher Nolan's aesthetics in the Dark Knight trilogy. This isn't too surprising given that filmmaker was the original architect of the DCEU. All of Nolan's Dark Knight flicks were quite realistic. After all, they were all set in Gotham that might just as well have been New York City. This was not the case with Man of Steel, which leaned heavily into the sci-fi aspects of Superman's powers. This unashamed love of the superhero genre will eventually become the standard for the DCEU to create a compromise. Compare Christian Bale's performance as Batman in The Dark Knight Rises to Ben Affleck's in Batman v Superman. Nevertheless, given how much of a trailblazer Zack Snyder's Man of Steel was for the DCEU, it's astonishing to see how self-contained that tale can be. This is a film that could easily stand alone without anybody knowing. In fact, Dawn of Justice does not count because it remains the only independent Superman film in the whole DCEU. It's odd that this is the only film he gets in such a huge franchise for such a well-known character. The Superman character is a little tough when it comes to superhero films and stories. While Supes may be the pinnacle of what a true superhero should be, some critics argue that his character has become repetitive with time. This concept arose in part as a result of Superman's nearly flawless nature and overwhelming powers. Although Superman's strengths appear to be unequaled, the weaknesses and defects of other heroes are comprehensible. Despite the criticisms directed at him through the comic book history, one might argue that he is the idolized human being in every sense. Consider for a second that a man like Superman appears out of nowhere on Earth one day. Absolute fear would be the most rational reaction to such a life-changing event, or at least the one that the majority of people would feel straight away. Who's to say this being wouldn't one day renounce his claim to humanity? Should he be feared or revered? These concerns are critical to Zack Snyder's portrayal of Superman, and they give Man of Steel a level of narrative complexity that is rare in popular superhero films. On the other hand, this depiction of Superman as a near-godlike being is fully consistent with some of his most well-known comic book tales. There's no denying that Christopher Reeve's Superman is one of the most recognisable live-action superhero portrayals ever seen, but few people could imagine Reeve's Superman facing off against Doomsday or Darkseid, let alone both, as Henry Cavill's version had to do in the DC Extended Universe. When the main character in a superhero film is cast, a significant portion of the fanbase almost always thinks that the film will fail because the actor or actress does not resemble the character in the comics. Yes, most of the time, but Henry Cavill might be one of the very few exceptions. The fact that not just die-hard Snyder supporters, but also casual moviegoers were dissatisfied when it was announced that Cavill would be replaced in James Gunn's next film, Superman Legacy. It shows just how iconic Henry Cavill was as Superman, ranking him among the best of all time, with the likes of Christopher Reeves. While Cavill's portrayal of the titular Man of Steel is a tad more solemn than Reeves, it perfectly reflects Clark Kent's personal growth in the film. The premise is that Clark Kent, whose face and body are virtually identical to the comic book ideal of Superman, but whose point of view is totally different, is a guy who lives in the shadow of an alien presence he can never really understand. This is a man who is not content with his elevated elevated status as a superhuman entity. On the contrary, he was well aware of his abilities were both a blessing and a curse, and that he couldn't utilize them without causing collateral harm. He had to remain concealed until the day came when he could finally disclose himself to the world, but this day could mean that the world he knew would forever shift for the worse. With this, Snyder and the team made the correct choice in casting Michael Shannon as General Zod in the film's main antagonist. Despite the fact that most people associate Lex Luthor as Superman's most dreaded adversary, the fact that a Kryptonian or Kryptonians is a bad guy or gal here supports Zack Snyder's central thesis. Even someone as powerful as Superman can be corrupted with a promise of even more power. Whether you like Superman as a character or believe he is too flawless to be desirable, there is no disputing that superhero films like Zack Snyder's Man of Steel are no longer created. While Man of Steel establishes the norms and aesthetics that would allow the DCU to try and compete with the MCU, it reimagines Superman for a new generation of audience eager to see the side of a Kryptonian never seen before. Man of Steel's grounded reality and more solemn, deliberately approach contrasted sharply with the Marvel's attitudes in their own films, helping to distinguish the DCU from the MCU. With its plot, music, tone, sensibility, naturalistic acting, and exhibition of superhuman abilities, Man of Steel stands out in the early DCU, straddling the line between Nolan's version and Snyder's version. In that way, it stands out in the DCU and Snyder's trilogy. The film's attention to realism results in some of the best action and sci-fi moments. We see the massive damage fought as Superman falls into a mountain. When he crashes, the pavement on the road breaks away and crumbles. He fights and the structures crumble. And when he soars, oh my god, when he soars, sonic booms, swirling clouds, and spaceships in orbit. Everything is a fantastic depiction of the entire force and impact of such unleashed power. The concentration of such power in one location, with so much potential for change and reason to hope, is accompanied by fear of the magnitude of the power and its manifestation in one place, resulting in both hope and cynicism about responsible use and potential abuse. This anxiety exists not just in the society following Superman's appearance, but also inside Superman himself, who is unsure how and when to utilize his powers. Man of Steel moves Superman into the current day, exploring themes of xenophobia, militarism, faith, colonialism, and fall of empires, and if contemporary humanity has lost sight of what drives us, as well as whether we have abandoned the use of immense force for huge good. Such deconstruction is frequent and popular in comic books, where these characters and stories have been portrayed for over a century. Many attempts have been made to reevaluate Superman's function, as well as what exactly makes him and his worldview tick. Despite some criticism and that the film doesn't have enough funny moments and super rescues, Man of Steel holds up nicely and ages like a fine bourbon. Subsequent DCEU films delve further towards deconstruction and received backlash as a result. Man of Steel, on the other hand, struck a solid balance. Many people have expressed their displeasure with this version of Superman, arguing that he is not the Superman we know and love, a Superman of hope like Christopher Reeve's Superman, but I disagree passionately, and here's why. In the film's last scene, he and the General discuss how Superman is a friend, but he will not be a soldier. In the scenario, Superman states that he was born and raised in Kansas.
I grew up in Kansas, General. About as American as it gets.
Highlighting how really American he is. However, as compared to the period of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Americans from other nations yearning for a new home were considerably different then in 2013. In February 1940, two American friends devised a plan for Superman to avert World War II. "Put me down, you are hurting me," Adolf Hitler says to the Man of Steel. Superman, on the other hand, has more intentions. Superman seizes their Nazi commander and travels to Moscow quicker than any plane to bring him to Joseph Stalin. The power-mad scoundrels will then be sent to the League of Nations in Geneva, where they will be found guilty of unprovoked aggression against defenseless countries. The comic strip How Superman Would End the War began in Look magazine nearly 2 years before the United States joined the war against the Nazi Germany as a Soviet ally. Few people realized at the time that Superman's creators, writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster, were the children of Jewish immigrants. Zack Snyder demonstrated to viewers how a classic Superman might respond to a contemporary setting. Superman remains the same in Henry Cavill's new optimistic role. What has changed is how the world sees him. Superman hasn't changed. We have. Well, that's enough rambling for one day.